Today we have the honor of presenting Michelle Dennedy from McAfee, who is the VP and Chief Privacy Officer. Before becoming to McAfee, Michelle founded the Identity Project, a consulting and advisory company specializing in privacy and security sensitive organizations. Michelle is also a founder and editor-in-chief of a new media site, theidentityproject.com, that was started as an advocacy and education site currently focused on the growing crime of child ID theft. Michelle was the Vice President for Security and Privacy Solutions for Oracle before coming to McAfee. Her team was responsible for evangelizing the role Oracle could play in the information strategy community as an important provider of security solutions for business. Before the Oracle acquisition of Sun, Michelle was Chief Data Governance Officer within the Cloud Computing Division at Sun Microsystems Incorporated. Michelle also served as Sun's Chief Privacy Officer, where she was responsible for the development and implementation of Sun's data privacy policies and practices, working across Sun's business groups to drive the company's continued data privacy excellence. Michelle has a JD from Fordham University School of Law and a BS degree with university honors from The Ohio State University. In 2009, she was awarded the Goodwin Procter IAPP Vanguard Award for Lifetime Achievement and the EWF CSO Magazine Women of Influence Award for work in the privacy and security fields. Please welcome Michelle Dennedy.
Thank you. I'm exhausted by myself. I'm either very old or feckless or both. Thank you very much for having me. This is such a thrill to me. This is one of the great institutions of innovation, and I've spent most of my career really involved and engaged with kind of the industrialization of everything that you guys do here with base science. Before I came to Sun Microsystems, I actually was a patent litigator. So taking a lot of the ideas that are coming out of your head and turning them into something that was a piece of ownership property. And that experience really kind of led me into the privacy realm to look at the concepts of, it's the conjoinder of human rights, contractual law, ownership aspects, and international relations is data privacy. So I'm hoping to make this an interactive session. Everybody always says that and then lectures for an hour. So as soon as you're done chewing, I may call on people to do karaoke if you don't ask questions. So I'm just warning you now, even you on the webinar, I'll find a way. So I want to kind of intersprinkle the pragmatic aspects of how you build these programs along with the kind of hot and cool topics that are going on, if privacy can ever be considered hot and or cool. So we'll go along here. So data privacy, just to kind of set the tone, because I think there's a lot of different definitions where people think that privacy is about secrecy or privacy is only about anonymity. I look at data privacy as the authorized processing of personally identifiable information. So that's not necessarily a secret like my preference for red, for example. That can be my IP address in conjunction with the time I was using my carrier to access a certain website on a certain device in a certain location. All of that triangulates to me and can be deemed personally identifiable. The other concept that we'll talk about a little bit is authorized. So who gets to authorize? How much information do you need before you make the choice to give someone permission to process data on your behalf? And do you have the capacity? So for certain jurisdictions, for example, if you are an employee, you inherently are incompetent to make a decision about your privacy. The government says that you are always under undue pressure, and so you cannot decide to authorize your processing. And so we need a different vehicle to manage information about employees in certain places. The other concept I want to talk about today is privacy by design. Yes, we have a question. I'm so excited.
Can you explain that anecdote a little bit more? Employees are incompetent to make what kinds of decisions?
So it's interesting. So I'm actually alluding specifically to the European Union. So the European Union currently is under a directive, a data directive. Now, a data directive basically sets the floor standard for all the member states. So unlike the United States, where we have one federal government, they have a coalition in the European community, and they basically say, here's the floor level of privacy. And that directive that was issued in 1995 had to be implemented by all the member states in the European Union. And what there's a working group called the Article 29 Committee. It does not have the force of law, but it has the force of tremendous influence over how we build systems. And the Article 29 Committee several years back said that an employee is always in a position of influence by his or her employer in the European Union. So, for example, if I said to you, what I'd like to implement today is some sort of a tracking system so that I know all of your movements, so that I can have some sort of an efficiency system to measure my sales and your personal productivity. Under basic law, where you say, here's the notice, here's what I'm going to do with your data, and would you like me to do that? A normal arm's length transaction, you could say yes, or you could say go pound sand. If you're an employee and you like receiving your paycheck on a regular basis, you're probably influenced to say yes. And so, as a protective measure in many jurisdictions, the law says in Europe and certain other places that an employee simply cannot consent. It's almost like a parental consent. So you just simply don't have the competence because you are under this undue influence. It's a policy decision of how we're going to manage that information. What it means on a pragmatic level is we still do need these efficiency systems in many cases. Monitoring is a very top hot issue in many places for this reason. So a corporation may want to monitor to avoid employee theft, for example, in a retail context. The employee still has a right to personal integrity and privacy, particularly in the European Union, where the concept is based rather than in property right and commercial interest, as it is here in the United States, but more so under the human right and the right to privacy. And obviously, 60 years ago, we saw the devastation when privacy rights are not respected, when information is used to literally cull citizens and call them out based on ethnicity or religion, and then systematically murder them. It's one of the greatest privacy disasters of all time. And that's the basis of a lot of the ethic behind the European laws. And you'll see that theme repeated time and time again, is abuse of information on a mass scale and automated processing. So privacy by design is actually, it's a dovetailed type of a concept. So there's a group of regulators that meet once a year, the International Data Commissioners meeting. And several years ago, Anne Kavukian from Canada, who is the Ontario Data Commissioner, coined this term, privacy by design. Now this is something that we in the engineering community have been doing for several years, but this kind of gave voice to this concept about architecting controls in, baking in instead of adding on to the end. Really understanding the contemplation of a data-sensitive system, even if it's not a data privacy tool. So privacy by design is much more about looking at data, and specifically in our current context, big data, and figuring out ways to put in controls, to put in audit mechanisms, to put in segregation mechanisms, for example. And we'll delve into this concept a little bit deeper as we go along here. So to back it up one step is, what is personal information? Just to get a little more specific. Your name, your contact information, things you would normally think that are associated with you, a passport number, a driver's license, some other government-issued notion of you. Your social security number, although it is not supposed to be any sort of an identifier, and specifically says within the regulations of the Social Security Administration, has indeed become our national ID card, since we don't have one. And so that number is associated and is always called out in almost every law that you'll see, specifically as personally identifiable. I highlighted this point because I think this is the next great point of contention here. Information that is otherwise non-personal information, when it's associated or combined with personal information. So, for example, I'll give you two examples. One is the title, my title, Chief Privacy Officer. My company name, McAfee, a date, August 1st, 2011. When you put all those pieces of data together, who was the CPO on August 11 at McAfee, it equals me, and uniquely me. So that becomes a piece of personally identifiable information from a pile of things that otherwise are just disjointed pieces of information. Where things become very, very interesting is when you consider the problem or the opportunity in this room of metadata, IP address, SIM cards, mobility identifiers. All of the things that make big data possible may be considered personally identifiable information, and all of the rules and regulations and policies and ethics that apply to personally identifiable information may now be applied to machines. And that's a very big sea change, and that's why we're going to go back to the concept of privacy engineering and privacy by design and your roles as citizen engineers. PI, personal information, is not dependent on the medium. So this can be paper, this can be electronic. When you hear a lot in the media or you hear a lot of the discussions either on the state level or in Washington, D.C., you're always hearing about the latest cool electronic toy or tool. But paper is just as important. So after Hurricane Katrina, for example, the CPO of many of the insurance companies went down to New Orleans and literally were raking in soaked documentation that had everybody's personally identifiable information, because that information can be used extensively to perform fraud against those insurance agencies and identity theft against those people, especially when you have some sort of a natural disaster or other displacement. That's when you have an exceedingly high sensitivity, particularly to paper documentation. Some sensitive information, and I put that in quotes, receives extra protection. So sensitive depends on where you are culturally. So in the European Union, there are specific categories that are deemed to be sensitive information. And interestingly enough, financial data is not included in that category. Trade union membership, religion, sexual orientation, those categories are. Health information is deemed sensitive almost everywhere you go in the world. When you get to the United States, what do we care about culturally? Financial data, children's data, healthcare data. These are the pieces and categories of data that you see specific pieces of vertical legislation to protect. So rather than having a comprehensive legal scheme, as they do in Europe, we have a piece-by-piece segmented strategy here in the United States. It causes great difficulty because obviously, and think about cloud computing here. When you talk about cloud, the beauty of a cloud is the scalability, the ability to be ubiquitous, the ability to connect from anywhere, anytime, any place, on a very scalable and economically relevant fashion. Well, when you consider that sensitive information in one jurisdiction is not sensitive information in others, either you build a sensitive engine, and so you give the highest level of protection to all the data, which can be tremendously difficult to do if you include machine data in that bucket, or you have to decide how to segment your systems. And a lot of the pragmatic cloud providers of today, whether they call themselves cloud providers or not, they set up various data centers according to what are these categories of sensitive information, what are the regulatory needs and requirements. It's not just the engineering, it's engineering balanced against the ethics, the politics, the taxing of that information. So when you're in design mode, and we'll get back into privacy engineering, think about how this piece of technology is going to fit into that context, where you may or may not have to have a geosensitivity to information. Or maybe you get an injunction from Spain, but you don't in Qatar. And so you want to figure out, do I want to cauterize that Spanish data and take that out? Well, then you better have some sort of geosensitivity built into your system. If you don't want to be deemed to have a lot of personally identifiable information, you may want to engineer so that you're segmenting different data points so that you can separate them and not commingle them and turn them into higher pieces of regulated data. So the definition of personal information sounds fairly straightforward, but it is the starting point for any design. So when I'm meeting with my engineers, I'm actually flying on Saturday to go meet with my Indian engineers, this is where we start. This is where we discuss what is personally identifiable information today, and most importantly to me, what's it going to be in 5 years? A lot of the products and things and the designs that we're working on at McAfee are to try to meet cyber challenges that are going to happen today and obviously going forward, because we want to use this as a competitive advantage. What I don't want to do is set up a giant information pool, not be able to segment it, not be able to audit it, not be able to manage the data, and then it doesn't matter how cool the technology is, I simply won't have the access to that information to exploit for commercial rights and to protect the people whose information is housed in that fiduciary setting. So increasingly, and this is an important one, increasingly personal information is defined by any information that can reasonably be linked to a person. So a lot of the debate, especially when Alessandro Acquisti's great research came out that said anonymization is a fuzzier term than we may have thought in the past. We're not looking for a Carnegie Mellon standard of who can possibly put information together. It's a reasonable standard, but that said, once a regulator has shown that it is possible to reconstitute data, you can pretty much bet that that's going to be a standard that you're held to on a corporate level. So it's very interesting, the juxtaposition here of engineering research and pragmatic application, because in the center of this, you have politicians who are involved in a dozen different types of conversations, and somehow we have to get our point across as a technical community and understand what is reasonable, what is ethical, and that we've considered all of those bases. If you come in with just a very cool tool, their ears will fall silent. If you come in and you just say, this is something that's important to create jobs, that may make Fox News, but it's not going to make it in the corporate setting where you actually have to exploit that information for corporate worth. I think we went through some of this stuff, so I'm going to pass through it kind of quickly. More personal information. I wanted to also put some extra slides in here just so you could have them if you wanted to download them and look. Authorization extends from the data owner, and it's always difficult when you're talking about ownership in the data privacy context, particularly as we're getting out to the edge of national security protection, cyber warfare. Who owns aggregate data? Who owns usage patterns on phones, usage on airlines, usage on your own credit report if it's been hijacked? Do you own that? Does the credit agency own that? Does the government own that? Those are very different and difficult legal and philosophical questions. So I always think about, from a pragmatic perspective, who has fiduciary responsibility and control? Can you manipulate this data in any sort of fashion along the way, whether it's by regulation, by legal implication, by permissioning of the user themselves? Who's got the fiduciary chain? Theoretically, it all comes from the individual about whom the data is described, or described by the data. Thank God it's not English. This is engineering, right? So processing of information. So remember, it's a personal information authorized for processing. So what is processing? Processing can mean just about any kind of thing you can do to data. Collect it, record it, look at it remotely on a thin client screen with absolutely no local presence. That's processing data. Retrieving information from a data set that you may already own in a different context. That's processing information. Certainly disclosure, or sending or transmitting. So taking your local account and sending it on to a public cloud account like a Yahoo address. That's processing of information. So privacy is very, very, very wide ranging. And so when you think about how you're managing a privacy system or a piece of technology that's going to be used to promote information processing, think very, very broadly. Spyware and other spooky stuff. Regulation is not just about personally identifiable information and the rights that may inure to the data subject. It's also about kind of this feeling of creepiness. And I think I've seen that in more legislative testimony and record than I'd care to say. What is creepy? So without authorization, you have to think about the proportionality of user control and who's actually looking at the system. Right, so accessing a third-party system can be considered spyware if you don't have the appropriate authorization, both from the owner of that system and potentially of the data users of that system. Collecting information, collecting information also. So if you're just going in and collecting information out and creating your own data set. So think about three-letter agencies that want to come into telcos, and they want to just collect information on people's buying habits or their usage habits. That may be considered spyware in the wrong context, in the wrong planning. And then using that information. So even if you get that information, I love this. So when you go out there and you work with folks in the real world and you get a marketer and you say, hey, I got this great bunch of opt-in data, you always ask what they mean by that, because usually they don't know. Usually a vendor has said to them, here's a pile of data, go use it, I have permission to do so. Usually that means that they have permission from whoever owns the database to resell the information. It may or may not be information that you can actually use, and it can actually turn toxic if you integrate it with your system and can't get that information out and disentangle it from the information that you do have permission to use. So I want to take a pause before we dive into privacy by design for more questions. All right, I was all encouraged there. I thought you were going to start the wave. That's all right. So the 7 foundation principles, again, this is kind of Anne's last. Anne Kavukian is the commissioner for the province of Ontario. One is being proactive and not reactive. So in the security context, people have been talking about build it in and not bolt it on for a long time. For privacy, it actually is probably even more important, because basic policies, basic definitional concepts like what is the data, how will it be processed, where will it be located, how will it be used in a third party or secondary use fashion, have to be contemplated before you start building. So think about it very proactively. When you do that, by the way, you probably end up at the end with a much more valuable tool. So it's not just the technology that works. You actually have something that you can go sell that has a context, that already has features kind of built in. It's not just bigger, faster, scalable, which is how we've marketed technology for 1,000 years. It actually is something in context that manages information that solves a real-world problem. So this proactive notion is proactive profit as well as it is proactive engineering, in my mind. Privacy is the default setting. So this is actually kind of a political hot potato right now. This concept, if you think about it in the Facebook concept, Facebook has been being kicked around, justifiably so, by the way, for having a bunch of privacy controls that arbitrarily change from time to time. I just went into my settings again and found that all sorts of apps that I'd never downloaded or never interacted with now had permission to see my entire contact list. How this happened, I don't know. I'm a privacy dork. I check a lot. It still happens. I think a lot of this is these various services are springing up very quickly. They're very competitive with one another for the advertising dollar. They may or may not have done privacy by design. So privacy as a default, I don't think, and this is my view and not necessarily the political prevailing view, is I don't think that means do not share necessarily. If the point of something is to share, so let's look at Snapfish, for example. The point of Snapfish is to share photos. So the privacy by default setting can still be to share, but the default is not with third parties without my direct intervention, right? So this doesn't mean it's an off switch necessarily, but it's a little bit of a hot button. And as you dive into the privacy by design debate, you'll hear more and more about this privacy as the default setting. I do think it's quite dangerous for newer services that haven't been tested, that don't really have their own place in the marketplace, to have the default setting be spray data everywhere. If people are just learning how to use your system, it probably is a method and a point of fairness to make sure that they understand the possible implications. I don't think Facebook even understood the possible implications of having all of these apps interacting with absolutely no supervision. So that's where the evolution is coming. And I hate to keep pointing at Facebook, but Facebook and Google are kind of the poster children for some of these big data problems and opportunities as well. Full functionality is principle number 4, positive sum, not zero sum. So this is a direct conversation, security and privacy. So certainly in the public policy debate, and certainly right after 9/11, you heard that privacy was not important because we had to protect our borders. People are going to die if we don't compromise our privacy. You know, if that TSA agent doesn't have her hand down my pants, oh my God, the plane could explode. I don't know what's down there, but so far, the plane has not exploded, you know, for years and years before they started sticking their hands down people's pants. But that's a different issue. Not even a little smile. I'm going TSA on you guys. Work with me. But in all truth, that is a perfect example of positive sum privacy. What is the balance of intervention and interrupting personal liberties with what's the outcome? So when you're doing privacy by design, think about how much security is proportional to the data you're trying to protect. Have you put in other compensating controls where a technical control is inappropriate? And how does this compromise potentially the right of the data subject to have that data be an integral piece of his or her identity? These are assets that are growing in importance to every individual. Your data footprint is your asset profile in the new world economy. Who you are just reputationally is important, but also what you know, how you know it, what you were entitled to, what companies will give you in terms of not just discounts, but in terms of information and access, all depends upon your data footprint. And so when we're thinking about the zero sum versus positive sum game, I think when you build privacy rights in the beginning, rather than saying we can dismiss the privacy issue so that we can be more secure, I think that's a huge mistake. And I think you're going to end up with a much more brittle system that you're going to have to break down later. So I'm a very big advocate for this positive sum and not zero sum discussion very early on in the design process. That said, end-to-end security. So understanding security in depth for the entire life cycle of information, understanding upon collection Everyone's all excited when they're collecting the data. Everyone's all excited when they're initially using the data. People start to lose interest as data ages, and we just collect more and more and more. Or we've collected a lot because we didn't really know what we needed. And then we never really went back again during the life cycle to say, now we know what we need, and let's stop collecting the stuff that we don't. I've never seen a company yet that has really done a comprehensive review of that nature to say, gosh, we did over-collect, we're only using X, let's get rid of Y. And I think that's where a lot of the risk lies, pragmatically. It's untended, unowned information that is the easiest to be exploited. And it's all personal information. So if you get a piece of that untended data and you use it as a worm to get to the core account or the healthcare information or the other piece that is entirely valuable, it doesn't really matter where you found the wormhole, you're in. Visibility and transparency, keeping these systems as open as possible. Again, you have to balance this against security. You can't tell everyone what your security architecture is, chapter and verse, or you don't really have a security architecture. That said, if, I think this is a Bruce Schneier quote that, if security is dependent upon secrecy only, you really don't have a secure system because someone's going to know, it's going to be brittle. So understanding what the visibility is, what is the level of risk, being very clear with people what that is up front, both users and operators of systems, and certainly downward players, vendors, and customers of data. Understanding how that information fits together as an asset is really critical. And then 7, just respecting user privacy. So we get all excited about these tools and these techniques and these new business models, and we kind of forget about the user at the end of the day. So the 7th privacy principle for privacy by design is to go back and go, okay, now that we've thought about this whole system and what it means to me, what does this still mean to that customer? Am I still bringing them value based on all the trade-offs and compensating controls and the things they need to read and know to understand this thing? How much education does it take to make my user able to competently use the system without harming themselves? So think back to that user centricity. So the fair information practice principles, I thought about for this talk how much law stuff to put in, but I think what you really need to know at the bottom line are the fair information processing principles. These really are the foundations for every law around the world. They're interpreted differently, and we have different sensitivities, and we use different language. So when I'm in China, for example, I never use the word privacy. It doesn't translate. It doesn't, literally, even figuratively, it doesn't really translate. It's been 3,000 years of collectivism. There is such a different level of respect for ancestry and prior knowledge. There's this notion of, and I'll butcher it for any Chinese speakers, I apologize, but there's this notion of the hukao. Is any Chinese speakers saying yes or no? I always say it wrong, and then they say it back to me and they say hukao, and it sounds exactly the same to me. But it basically is a document that says, this is where you're from, this is who your family is, this is basically who you are. And without one, you cannot get educated in the PRC. You need to have this document. It's very, very critical to who you are as a citizen. It's also very critical to their government. They've got 1 billion people to manage. It's not an easy data problem. I mean, you talk about big data, talk about trying to manage citizens on that scale. So understanding what those words mean when you're talking to different cultural people is really important. And fairness is it's a mathematical concept that I think we can understand. People understand when they're being creeped out. People understand when they're being watched. People understand when their information is being used to fuel someone else's worth and they're getting harmed in the process. So these are the basic principles that underline all these legislations. One is the collection limitation, gathering only information that you need for the process at hand. Trying to resist the marketeers that want to collect everything just in case. We might need it someday. Remember, those are the liability vectors. That's the way you get in, is by collecting too much information or allowing too much access. Data quality. Again, it's related very closely to the collection limitation, but understanding that the integrity of your information. So think about it, this to look through a security lens of the integrity of the information. Is it what it purports to be? Has it been tampered with? What's the life cycle of this information? How old or how new, or what's the origin? Where this comes down to kind of pragmatic application, this is years ago, and there was a big brouhaha, like 25 people in the room talking about moving a bunch of marketing databases from the European Union to the United States in a consolidation process. So it was an IT discussion about saving a lot of money for the business, and everybody was all worked up. And finally they said, oh, let's get the legal people in the room. And so they called me up, and I come in, and I just said, well, what's the data? Oh, marketing databases. This is really important. What's it about? Java. Oh, well, you say Java, son, it's like saying God. So I got to laugh on that one. Okay. Note to self. No pole dancing jokes. Yes on the Java jokes. Okay. Good. So they had already gone through this extensive process, and they're talking about what it would take, how much floor space, how many racks would it take, we need more HVAC, and and I finally just kind of said, okay, I hate to be the new guy in the room, but how old is this data? 15 years. I said, okay, so let me just push this issue a little bit further. For the European Union, do we know who our customers are that are newer than 15 years? Yes. Is it housed in a different database, and was it collected in a different place? Yes. Are we interacting with those people on a regular basis? Yes. Then why don't we just pull the plug and not move the data? And they all kind of went, oh. And that's what we did. So instead of spending $15 million on a brand new colo and doing all these crazy legal agreements, which is why they thought they brought me in the room, we actually looked at what's the quality of the data? Was it going to bring us any value? And at the end of the day, the answer was no. So this is where citizen engineer comes in. You're not just coming in to talk about HVAC and floor space and rack value and should it be a virtualized container and oh goody, we get to use our new cloud facility. You're there to be a person that understands the asset value of information. That's why you build any of these tools, to be a benefit to the organization and to the citizens around you. Use limitation. Use limitation is really understanding the context in which you collect information. So if I give my child's teacher information about my kid so that I can be contacted during the day if something goes wrong, I don't really want her to go and start a knitting business on the side and start marketing to me. It's just a mismatch of position. We do this all the time in the corporate setting. The government does this quite often, where they'll gather information about taxes and then suddenly send it over to do healthcare or insurance reform or whatever they want to do. So use limitation is really important when you contemplate how big or broad or wide or risky your system will be. Security safeguards, it's hard to even package into two little words how important security is to privacy. You can have a ton of security and no privacy. So you can encrypt tons of data, and it can be the wrong data that you weren't allowed to have. But you can't have any privacy without security because you won't have any of these other principles. You won't have any data integrity. You won't know what the purpose limitation is. You won't be able to send it to the right person in the right context. So security cannot be overemphasized in the privacy context. And instead of going to war with one another, it really has to become a more and more integrated concept as we move along where we're going in the data continuum. Openness, again, it's that transparency principle we talked about in privacy by design. Individual participation. To the greatest extent possible, the data subject should be able to correct information, access that information, and delete it if it's not correct. Unfortunately, this has kind of slipped out into a debate that you'll hear more about in the coming years about the right to forget. How many people have heard this? Okay, a smattering of hands here. So those are my privacy geeks have now revealed themselves. So the right to forget is something that the European Union is saying, there's a case in Germany right now where someone was convicted of a crime, they did their time, and they're saying, I need a clean slate now, but Google has all these records about my conviction. It's a true conviction, the facts are correct, they actually did the crime, they actually did go to jail, but what they're saying is, in the old world, time would pass and people would forget our transgressions. Now, with the information age, everything looks as new as it was on the day it was born, and so we should have this quote-unquote right to forget. I find this, as a pragmatic person who's been on the business end of this for so many years, a very, very dangerous concept. This means secret censorship to me. We have to decide. So, for example, I'll go back to, these are not the facts of the German case, but imagine for a moment if this was a rape case. So the perpetrators have gone off, they've served their time, they delete all the records. Where does that leave our victim? Does she have a right to have that record out there in the public? What if she has had a child? Is that just a bastard? Or is this someone that deserves to have that data record be solid and in place? So you see very quickly you can trip into these very interesting rules that are not the same thing as going to a CMU party and being spotted drunk on Facebook. I understand that people want to make sure that they're containing that type of information that they've inadvertently disclosed or others have disclosed, but you have to really take a much wider societal view and understand before we implement. And I may be way too late. So this is what they're doing in Brussels today, is trying to implement this right. But as a practitioner, I think it's very, very dangerous to do revisionist history. I mean, wasn't that the central job of the protagonist in 1984? So as we talk about our privacy not going away, we don't really want someone modifying what the news is. Now, that said, individual participation should say, if I'm at a party and someone has tagged me and I don't want to be up, there should be a mechanism to take that information out. I think that's going to come out of a lot of the people in this room, how we actually have those mechanisms so that we can go out on the web. The web shouldn't be forever for fraudulent, bad, or defamatory information. But by the way, the gal who was the drunken pirate, do you guys know about the drunken pirate case? Okay. So there was a young woman who was a teacher down in the South, and she was pictured with a pirate hat on, and she had one of those red ubiquitous cups that we know what's in there. It was not a beer bottle, was not labeled as a beer bottle, but someone tagged a picture of her on a social media site and wrote drunken pirate. Well, by Monday morning, the school got wind of this, and some parent was outraged that their child's teacher was a bad moral example, and she was summarily fired. So obviously a grave misuse of information. If you are a drunken pirate, please come work for me. I actually want people who are socially integrated. I don't think that was a sign that this woman was a chronic drunk. It just meant that she got invited to a party and someone gave her a cup of beer. So I think that there's a lot of those issues that need to be worked out. It should be her right to take that photo down, particularly if it impacts her entire career and her standing within that very kind of interesting community. She's probably better off. She probably moved to a place where she could have a cup of beer. Yes?
But on the flip side, she might be a drunken pirate, in which case it's the right of the children's parents to know.
Exactly. So I don't know if you caught that, because it's a critical point, is interrupting the right of the parent to know if she is indeed a drunk or a pedophile or convicted of fraud, and you're about to hand over your Girl Scout dues to her. That may interrupt the right of the child to have their integrity.
So where exactly does that leave us? Because it seems like for any case we can argue that yes, maybe somebody should be allowed to erase information, or no, maybe somebody should not.
Well, so I think so this is where I'll totally weenie out on you, and I'll fall back on the law. I think jurisprudence for defamatory behavior, whether it's slander or libel, we have about 200 years of case law and touch and feel. It's not perfect. So when are you a public person and when are you a private person? If you're on Facebook and you've got 5,000 fans, does that turn you into a public figure for the purposes of defamation law? I don't know. I think that still needs to be worked out. But I think those tests and those principles of what does it mean to be defamed, what does it mean to be able to control your own reputation, I'd like to see the fight there rather than having this right to forget that's not so easily defined or uneasily defined, I should say. In my mind, it's the same thing with opting in and opt out. I like informed choice. It comes out of tort law. There's a lot of discussion in case law that can be used analogously. I fear when we make up new terms like the right to be forgotten, because it does make sense in certain contexts and it seems very righteous. But you're absolutely right. There's always a shadow for maybe the fact, an absolutely true fact in a public context. Now, private context, if you want to dress up in a bunny suit and dance around with your wife, that's pretty clear. Right to privacy, that's at least in California, that's a constitutional issue at that point. But if you're doing it out on the street in the middle of a protest, or you're in Beta, our Beta Bridge run is notorious for having naked runners, and you have your bunny ears and that's all you're wearing and you're running it in the public, is that something you should be able to delete online? That's a debate I want to have, but not necessarily to be legislated before that debate is had. So I think that's where we're at right now. Yeah.
So is there a distinction from a privacy perspective as to who made the information public? For example, if you posted the picture of yourself doing a thing, well, that's you making yourself a public figure. But if somebody else posts that picture and tags you, is that different from a privacy or legal perspective?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for the web, I'll repeat that because it's an important one, is does it depend on who posted that picture? So if you post your own information about yourself, change your mind and want to change or modify what you've posted. And I think this is true for blogs or political statements, for example. You may in college be a complete right or left winger, and then as you get older, change affiliation, and you may not want that, picture of you, with Mein Kampf aloft over your head. I'm just thinking you might not. I think that this is where the crux of the right to be forgotten is really being discussed. In the policy context, it really is, do kids who are the primary users of a lot of the social networking, do they have the capacity to share in a way that should be forever? And I think, so this is, a fallback into my bias, which is technology. I would love to see something like Radio Perlman years ago, great cryptographer. She came up with something she called the ephemerizer. Have any of you guys heard of this thing? Oh, I love the ephemerizer. So basically what she did is you could self-tag information with a crypto key. And after a certain period of time, the key would be lost. And so wherever that information was duplicated, particularly in a corporate system, it's very difficult to get information completely out because it's replicated across various systems of record. So it would be lovely to say that when you post a picture of yourself and you're 13, it times out at 18 and you throw away the key pair. I think there are some interesting technical possibilities there to think about how do we protect children in particular who may or may not care about their financial status or what it would mean to make certain political statements because they don't have jobs yet. And then when their context changed, should that information be held against them? I think the other cultural context to all of this is the first generation of people who have that stuff from their collegiate years are now graduating and becoming mortgage-holding, kid-having, car-driving people. So I think that debate also will start to level out a little bit where, the first, I did not inhale discussion from Clinton. We're pretty sure Bush was smoking it the whole time through, right? Anyway, it's a joke, come on. I know it's the Midwest. But context changes is my point, and I think, as society changes too. Remember the great Brandeis article that is kind of the underpinning of American jurisprudence around privacy, the right to be forgotten, or the right to privacy by Brandeis. It was about technology. It was about the Kodak and the Polaroid. Was it Polaroid? I think it was Polaroid, not Kodak. But the camera was Instamatic. Now, Instamatic there meant like, picking up this desk and moving along the street. But it may inadvertently pick up a picture, a glimpse of a woman's ankle under her hem. And that's actually in the Law Review article from the Harvard Review. And I think it's 1893, and maybe 1896. It's a beautifully written article. I recommend it to every engineer in the world, actually, because it really is addressing technology and the fearfulness of being photographed and the permanence of that photograph and not having a staged, very specific photograph. And what would that mean to society? Would it be the breakdown of society to see a woman's bare ankle? Well, now I'd love to see one covered up, Way too much stuff. I live in California. There's way too much naked.
What's the name of the article?
It's called The Right to Privacy.
The one with about the...
Yeah, Brandeis is the author. And you know what? I can post that, too.
Thank you.
Let's see, what did I get in? Oh, and accountability. So at the end of the day, accountability. Fair information practice principles, particularly applied to governments and organizations, is to make sure that there are mechanisms to prove that you've done all of the other principles, right? So you're not just saying that we're going to get permission. There's got to be a mechanism to make sure everyone does it. There's got to be a way to measure it. There's got to be a way to come back and say, has circumstances changed where the protections have gone off? So whether that's an internal review by your audit committee, in a private context, or whether that's a requirement for the FTC to have outside auditors come in and review, or a matter of data commissioners around the world having individual jurisdiction over your companies. All of those are related to what do we think is the appropriate level of accountability, so that if you are a data fiduciary, you should be held into account for treating that information with the fairness principles. I'm going way over time. I'm going to go zooming through and make sure you guys have some questions and things. So this is I like this, I drew this 10 years ago and it's still valid, so that's why I keep showing it. back in the day, I actually was one of the first chief security officers in America. Little known fact. I was a 15-year-old part-time receptionist at ExxonMobil, and I had the key that opened the broom closet that held our Wang. Do you guys even know what a Wang is? Oh my gosh, I'm so old. It was a computer. There was no Microsoft back then. It was a computer that was actually used so that once a month we would get it out and they would use it to do accounting and spreadsheets. We didn't have email back in those days, back in the dark days of the 1980s. And I was the only one with the key. So the ultimate security. It didn't do anything. It didn't talk to anyone. It didn't have any connectivity other than when we pulled it out and we would use it to reconcile the books once a month. So it was very easy to control our security back then. This is really the age of the firewall. When the firewall could encapsulate a data set, you knew what the data was. It was a quantifiable amount of information, and everything was within that context. And anything that got out of that context was either analog within your head or printed out on paper somehow. And the paper usually had those little lines down the side with the little dots, and they were all connected. You guys, back in the day, do you know what a floppy disk is? Okay, good. Okay, I'm feeling better. Feeling very ancient now. The age of the internet, this is when I was practicing law, when you had a document request, there was no email discovery, which was a blessing to me, because that can be millions and millions of pieces of documentation. A very big production for one of these major asbestos cases, for example, would be about 100,000 documents. And that was a very big deal. That was when you were going to spend $10 to $15 million on a lawsuit. Those boxes were carried by junior Sherpas like myself, and they were just physically paper stamped. There was a company called Bates, and it had numbers, and every page was physically numbered by a paralegal. And it was physically carried downtown to the courthouse and physically carried to opposing counsel. Every box was accounted for. If a box went missing, a cab got lost, there was a big blizzard in New York City when I was living there at the time, and a couple of these boxes for production went missing. It was a very big deal, and you had to go down to the courthouse and be held into account why you lost that information, where it was now, and what you were going to do to get it back. Very discrete transmissions of information, bounded by my fiduciary duty as a paralegal and later as an attorney when I graduated night school. Everyone knew when that transaction was occurring. So now the edge of the extranet. Managing data through a firewall, where there was discrete vendors, where there were discrete transactions, you could still manage through contract, through fiduciary duty, and through knowledge. Now we're in the age of access. So access is simply entitlements. You lift up and down your firewall so many times, you might as well not have one. The firewall is shrinking to encapsulate the data transaction rather than the enterprise. Which all leads us this is where the context of privacy engineering is today. For every system that you will produce in your lifetime, you are going to be in the era of big data. There's no discrete system anymore. There's nothing that you're going to do that won't be connected to some other group of information with its own fiduciary interests. There will be no more discrete transactions of large sets of data. There will only be this. And this is why privacy engineering is so critical at this stage in our evolution. Because we now have connectivity. Almost everyone has a smartphone. We have all of this work from home ethic. That never was even a consideration in the 80s and even the 90s, working from home. Now you have to protect the enterprise in the consumerization of data. So I bring my iPhone and I've got half my personal stuff on it and half of my professional stuff on it. If I do something bad at work, if I sexually harass one of my employees, and the company has a right to look at my information, it creates a whole new set of complexity of how do they review my personal life apart from my work life? How, if you've got a laptop or a server at home and you're working on CMU business, how do we contain that intellectual property? All of those things implicate privacy engineering because you are the one accessing the information. So the question will be, when did you access it? Who accessed it? Do we know that this person accessed it? What is your digital signature? How were you under control of this information? And when we talk about data sets having inherent value, patentability, ownership rights, and management and saleability of that digital assets will depend on how you've engineered your system with privacy in mind. So I'm going to run through very quickly the tool set. So the legal folks all like to talk about notice and consent, controls, and assurances. We like paper, so we like to document how you've told people, have you told them enough information, There's a raging debate at the Federal Trade Commission here in the US and certainly around the world that privacy notices, people don't read them, people don't like them, people don't feel informed by them, they don't get under the covers enough to tell any real information, and people like me are motivated to make sure that there's a balance of telling you enough stuff so that you can use our systems without telling you too much stuff, so we'll be accused of hiding things under too much complexity. It's a very tricky thing at this point. Consent, as we talked about at the beginning, can be a really tricky topic. Can you really say you can't use Facebook if you don't agree to all the policies, if it's the only prevalent thing? So in my daughter's school, and she's only 10, the teacher suggested that everyone get a Facebook account so that they could get on Khan Academy. Do you guys know Khan Academy? Oh, if you have kids, K-A-H-N, love Saul Khan. He's revolutionizing education. But it's a really great, it's just a great engineer who happened to be a natural teacher. And he took a bunch of videos of himself teaching his young niece how to do math. And now there's something like 75 million hits of all sorts of free content. Well, the Khan Academy was using Facebook as its authentication protocol. And so they're asking 10-year-old kids to get on Facebook to use the Khan Academy. Now that's changing for Saul Khan, thank God. But you have to be aware that that's where we're going, right? So talking about consent and controls for a 10-year-old child is obviously very different when you're talking about an adult. And what's an adult? I mean, we're talking about litigation in the social networking spaces for people who are 25 and 30 who have put information on there that they don't like and don't want to see and have changed their personal brands, or they've gotten married and they want to get rid of all their old girlfriends. So who is an adult? Who can consent? To what can they consent? These are all live hot topics in the legal world. And what are the appropriate levels of assurances? The engineering and the leadership folks should be talking about privacy enabling technologies. So pets are not the same thing as privacy by design. Privacy enabling or enhancing technologies are technologies that by themselves can be deployed within a privacy engineering context to help control or manage information. So I'd put encryption under that auspice. I would put thin client technology, having dumber and dumber terminals. There should be no intelligence on this system at all. There's no reason for it at all. So having dummy terminals instead of having our shrinking computer footprint being so intelligent at the end of it. Identity management can be looked at as a type of tool that can be used as a privacy enabling technology. UI design, user interfaces are really, really important. We're getting more and more into iconography. Lucky for you, you have Lori Craner here in her Privacy Bird. I hope you all know about Privacy Bird. She came up with this years and years ago now, because we've only been in this at like 2 years, right, Lori? Where it was an icon. It was a bird. She could tell you about the bird, but it was awesome. It was red, yellow, and green. And if that bird saw a privacy site that was doing bad things with data, that thing would squawk, and it was really annoying. And you would know that it was a bad thing. Well, Lori, of course, was way ahead of her time. That's what needs to happen on the smartphone today. We need the bird. So people are thinking more creatively, finally, about user interface and design, how to get to simplistic conversations about complex topics so that people actually can have more control of their information. We need to empower the user. Right now, on the legislative end, and certainly everywhere in DC and everywhere in Europe, it sounds like we're just this nation of victims. I can't possibly read a privacy policy. There's no way I could understand sharing data, dude. I think that is such an antiquated. We need to come up with tools so that we can say we are an intelligent nation. We can have some choice over our destiny. We're not a nation of victims. We can actually control our information footprint in certain ways. But they have to be real controls. The user interface has to be something that people can understand if they're not in the privacy profession. Understanding the whole information process lifecycle is critical to this, and promoting data stewardship. So whether or not you are deemed the privacy or security professional, there's someone in every business unit, and I use that term as broadly as possible. So whether you're in a university setting, a government setting, a not-for-profit, or just a family setting, having someone that understands enough about the data asset to care about it, to manage it, to think about it through its lifestyle, that's data stewardship. And privacy impact assessments are a tool that we use in the corporate context to catalog potential uses and data types, even if the engineers don't think they're particularly privacy sensitive, so that I have a method of looking at what I deem as quality. So a product that comes out from McAfee that doesn't have privacy and security built in, that doesn't have compensating controls, that doesn't very specifically tell me what the vulnerability is so that I can manage that, that's a quality defect. Okay, I'm now at the totally over the top of the hour, so I'm going to skip over some stuff and get to the end here. I've actually talked through a lot of this stuff. So, the Gapi Principles, I just want to point these out. You can find, and I put the link here, the AICPA, the American Institute of CPAs, accountants. They came up with this list of generally accepted privacy principles. So if you use an outside auditor, these are the principles that they use to build their maturity models. So this is a common tool that's used in practice, so that if you are, God forbid, on the end of an FTC requirement to do an outside audit, you've already built into your practices all these generally accepted privacy principles, so that you can measure them in a way that interoperates with other measurement devices. Okay, I'm going to walk through this stuff and just get to the end. So I want to leave you with this thought, and I did promise to be interactive, and we only did a little bit of that. But the word trust in privacy makes me want to start drinking in the morning. You hear about people, trust, and we're building trust, and it's trust engines, and most important thing's trust, and it's almost like, peace sticks with daisies. So I find the concept of trust misleading, and here's why. And it particularly applies to you people who are privacy engineers and citizen engineers. Trust is something that I feel. Trust is something that I decide internally, and each of us decides who we trust and how we trust. From an organizational perspective, you cannot build trust. Trust is what the other guy has. What you can build is repeatable practices that are observable in some way, or it can be communicated in some way, or can be ubiquitous enough in some way to engender the feeling of trust in other people. So within the organization, trust is a lovely thing to talk about if you're only talking to the marketing people. If you're talking about privacy engineering, you want to talk about the end game of actually having measurable and studied fair information principles baked in. You want respect. You want to show that you're, over time, every time they have an interaction with you, they get the same quality experience. Because trust can also be very negative. It used to be that certain computing companies, which I will not name, you could absolutely trust them. They would crash every time you loaded them up. I trusted them every time. You know who I'm talking about. There's a certain color associated with the blank screen of death. Very trustworthy. That's not necessarily a positive thing. You want your trust to be the positive thing that's the outcome of these fair information principles. And the way that interoperates when you're off getting budget, for example, within an organization is you have these objective principles now. Have you done a privacy impact assessment? How does this fit within the context of fair information processing? Have you contemplated the users? What are we using as compensating controls? What security aspects and privacy enhancing technologies have we deployed here? Is this a business differentiator for us, or is this us catching up with our competitors? So all of those things are measurable, quantifiable quality aspects, and then the trust will come. So respect first, trust will come. And I'll leave you with that unless there's a couple questions. I've already probably extended my free pizza of your patience. Yes?
I have two comments. One is that what you said, the Chinese word.
Use the button.
Oh, where's the button? Which you?
See, it's a user interface.
Okay, got it. Okay, so I cannot read it anymore. Okay, so first your Chinese word, 户口, I
Yes.
figured out. It means proof of residency. It is a very important thing in China. Yeah. For example, if you have
say the word again.
户口.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was a bit baffled.
I know, and I can tell you're like,
didn't realize.
kind of getting it, but no.
Okay, another thing is that the way we're going, you will have more and more footprints on the web. And then do you think people, especially the people who worry a lot, those people tend to be the intelligent group, okay? And will they become more timid and hesitant to express their opinions or even do something? For example, I know people who are afraid to borrow a book from the library, so that people wouldn't know, oh, you read this book, so you are tagged in a certain way. So that is really the right of forget, right? So the library should delete all of your borrowing record once the book is returned, right? So those things, can we really trust them to do that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question to ask. And I guess the heart of it is, will too much ubiquity of data and surveillance of that data create a chilling effect for use of all the technologies and use of the information society? And I think right now it's very generationally dependent. So you've got people like my mom who will spend with her credit card like she's Santa Claus, but she won't allow my dad to get a fast track because she feels like the government is tracking that. And I thought, it's exit 8A on the Jersey Turnpike, Mom, like what's the deal? But for her, that is an unknown thing. The fact that the credit card companies are packaging and reselling and profiling and giving her things based on that credit card use, in her mind, isn't frightening. So I think it's going to be this constant kind of balance. And I think the other interesting part of this, of course, is what does national security mean when we can do predictive measurement of activity, when we can understand when people are coalescing or putting together attacks. So LulzSec and Anonymous are really important conversations to think about right now. I mean, the damage that they have done already in just exploiting to see if they can exploit has been in the billions of dollars. If they ever really wanted to own systems, every system is owned. Every company, every government is owned at this point. It's really a matter of kind of a strange marauder's ethic right now that's keeping them from doing more stuff. So, but I think that's an important question, is when we have that many systems attached together, and remember, LulzSec and Anonymous is a name for something. People drop in and drop out of those hacktivist groups all the time. What does that mean vis-a-vis the powers that we're going to give to our security agencies? Are we going to share that across the globe? With whom are we going to share that? All of these are really important public policy discussions to think about. And as a private organization, you will be tapped to participate in that type of surveillance. And so for your own policies, you have to understand and predict and protect in the beginning so that you understand where you are as a business. So you can say, Yahoo in China, will we or will we not give up the name of the account? It can mean death to someone. Do you still want to do business there? Or do you want to just be that transparent that people understand that they may have to give up that information if a government actually comes and asks for that type of information? And that's where I think these notions of trust and respect come in more than anything else. So these zeros and ones are out there, and it's really, really important. But until you integrate them with who we want to be as a culture, as a global culture, and then as a local culture, that's how you build the system at the end of the day. So it's almost like looking at the environmental reports back in the day. We never used to think about where the waste would go when we built the factory. Now we do. So now we think about it as data waste, as kind of trust waste, if you will, when we're looking at building these systems and components. And the components of these systems are as small as an app. So we've got all these garage apps. There's an app out there called Girls Like Me. Have you heard that? Or Girls Near Me. Have you guys heard of this? So in my mind, gentlemen, there's a lot of lovely ladies who walk up to one and say hello. Girls, if you're using one of these apps, don't talk to some boy that found you on a Girls Like Me app. So that's my mother's point of view on the whole thing, is that just don't date a dude that has to find you that way. He's just too desperate for you. You're better than that. But I think the fear is that having all of these types of apps that scrape every piece of your social aspect to say where you are and who you're doing and what's your net worth, I think that becomes a very interesting thing, so that you're never just meeting someone for the first time. They've already got this massive profile and their own expectation of who you are. I guarantee you I'm not what I am on Facebook. I'm not what I am on Twitter. I'm not even what I am today because I'm kind of freaked out because you guys are really smart. I'm all of those things, right? So I think that's going to be an interesting thing, is when we realize how powerful the app is and attached to these massive data gathering systems. Yes?
You talked about Facebook and Google being both the poster children for problems with privacy and so on, and the poster children for opportunity. A lot of the opportunity. So I'm asking this question as somebody who believes in privacy by design, but I'm curious what your take on this. A lot of this opportunity comes from willfully ignoring privacy by design and getting every possible piece of data you can, and a decade or two later figuring out that you can do really cool stuff with it. So I'm assuming that we don't want those kinds of opportunities not to be possible in the future. So how do we reconcile our desire to retain opportunities like that with privacy by design?
It's an excellent question, and I don't mean to pick on them. I would go and work for either of those companies if they would actually let me do my stuff. I think that they're the poster children because the governments have made it so. They're under investigation around the world. And because of that reason, I think they have so much data amassed. The model is undeniable. If you told them now that they had to limit their data collection in some way, it's worth billions and billions of dollars for them to defy you or come up with a way around it. So do we want to limit the next great? Because I think Facebook is already starting to wane. There's very few young people that are using it anymore. It's all, like if I want to talk to privacy and security people, we're on Facebook, which shows you how desperately uncool it is, right? There's something cooler out there. We don't want to chill that, but I think the cool thing is I'm actually reading this great book. It's by Cory Doctorow. It's called Little Brother. Have you guys heard of this? It's a fiction work-ish. And it's about hacker kids in San Francisco after a fictitious bombing has taken out the Bay Bridge and killed a lot of people in San Francisco. And Department of Homeland Security comes in and basically turns it into a martial law state. And the reaction of these kids that say, I do want freedom. I do want ubiquitous data, but I do want freedom. I want to have my personality. I want to have my relationships. I want to have my apps. So I think that the drive to have that data and share that data will make the fear of chilling the next Google and Facebook a non-essential. There's enough economic worth out there. You could build a Google today and have privacy by design. There's nothing wrong with ads and eyeballs. I actually love their new privacy policy. It's the most honest thing they've done. They've always been sharing that data. I mean, who was surprised when that policy came out? It's stunning to me that anyone was surprised. I thought it was great. I said, you know, to the last 3 people that really thought Google was segmenting that data, we say, you were wrong, sorry about that. And you have choices. You don't have to use Google if you don't want to.
So is your answer then that you don't think privacy by design will get in the way of such innovation?
I really don't. I don't. In fact, I'll tell you, so my Facebook anecdote, which never gets told, I believe, and part of it was the sign of the time. So I live in the Bay Area. I see a ton of these startups. So Facebook was not an innovation. It was the right time for that sort of thing. There was Homestead before that. Of course, there was MySpace, and MySpace was this huge thing. Until a young child put her location and met a predator based on her site and was raped and murdered because of her MySpace. Suddenly, it was not so cool and not the best place to go get free music. It suddenly was a place where predators could prey. And so when Facebook first came out, they had a lot of privacy language. They sold you on Facebook because it was just the inside community of CMU, and just the inside community of Harvard, and just the inside community of Stanford. And look what upstanding and smart individuals these are. It was almost like the crowd control that happened in ARPA and DARPANET days. We're all smart people, we have an ethic, we're all scientists here, so we can control by flaming and shaming and having these kind of conversations. That's how Facebook got its momentum, and it built within those communities. And I remember the tipping point where they said, these are all closed circles of your social graph. And one of my circles was London. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know everyone in London. This can't possibly be a closed network anymore. And then all of that marketing went away. So I don't think that privacy by design stopped them from growing, because I actually think they had it in the beginning. I think they changed course a little bit along the way. So it's not impossible. So if any of you want to be the next big billionaire, it's all out there, it's available. Any more questions? He's like raring to go, I'm scared of him.
So just an observation, like you shared the anecdote about the pirate teacher and a few of these other anecdotes where it seems like culturally, the other one was like the convicted rapist and they've served their time. So people today, because it's very generational, some people have a huge digital footprint and some have none, right? If you do a Google search for me, there's a lot of stuff out there. If you do one for my younger sister, there's very little. And the volume of data, I think, matters a lot, right? If you do a web search for John Doe and the things that come up are a picture of him, intoxicated and a criminal conviction history, then you're not going to think much of the guy. But if, hundreds upon hundreds of pages of search results come up and the thing that happened 30 years ago is 30 years ago. And I sort of think that there's a cultural element of, I don't know a better term than people freak out because they don't appreciate that this is just one little drop in the bucket that happened to get digitized. And that doesn't seem like a legal problem to me. Right? That seems like a cultural problem.
It is a cultural problem, but what you've basically outlined is the debates that happened in the 1700s over the right to free speech, right? So if there's a speaker's corner, the cure for bad speech was more speech. That was the essence of debate, right? So that was deemed to be societally a great thing, and one of the foundational principles of this country is to actually be able to put crazy crap out there and have someone respond to it in a safe fashion. If you take away half that equation and you're one party's allowed to edit the other party, I think you kind of upset that balance. Now that said, that balance has its limits. So I remember having this debate with my husband, my poor baby. He's an engineer by training, and so he's very linear, and I'm very like, woo, what if daisies grew out of my head? So there was a young man who posted these incredibly graphic stories about this young lady, and these were kids. These were under 18, but 16, 17. And he was talking about, brutalizing this young woman with a curling iron and graphic, the smell of the sizzle of her flesh falling off her butt. Awful. And it was a real person. He hadn't done these things to her, and he didn't say that he was intending to do these things to her. But my side of the debate was, this is akin to digitally screaming fire in a crowded theater. And that speech, I think, should be controlled, particularly when the victim is quite young. And my husband took the position that speech should be protected. This was his free speech, and maybe by getting it all out there, this was his way of not going off and actually acting on it in real life. And this is the debate by pedophiles around the world that want to publish their books and things and say this is just free speech. This is a difficult debate in the digital age. This is not back to the speaker's corner where you could have this kind of scary debate and walk away from it. Now it's digitized, so you always can replay a piece or part or pieces of that debate that you particularly like and repackage it. So I think the argument is right and just that the cure for bad speech is good speech. I still think that's an excellent ethic and law in this country, but I also think that we do have some cultural kind of deciding to do about what we're going to do about this data. And it comes down, very specifically to the work that I do in the Identity Project, talking about cyberbullying. So is it your free right to say, Michelle's a hag, boy is she stupid, and then do all these flaming memes around so that people repeat that bad fact about me over and over? This type of information is causing our children to commit suicide. There are real life implications of free speech in that context. So I think there's a balance, and I think the balance is why we have courts and why we have an open society and why we have parents and why we have teachers. So I think, I say viva la debate. I'd rather have a debate than have a dictation that says thou shalt get off anything that people thinks is insensitive, because I think that's where the light does shine, and I think that's where things get interesting and innovative, and that's where you get the new Facebook, right? You squeeze out the side and you say, here's a safe place for kids to go play. And that's your $1 trillion idea. But don't take it, I thought of it first. So any more questions? Thank you guys very much. It's been really fun. Thanks for having me.